This day in sports history. Hey, and welcome back to another edition of This Dish, a member of the Sports History Network. More info and more podcasts can be found at sportshistorynetwork.com. It's September 27th, and on this day in 1991, it was the NHL's first foray into playing an outdoor game. Okay, a few things here before I really dive in. NHL teams had participated in games played outdoors twice before. The Detroit Red Wings played an exhibition against some convicts in Michigan back in 1954. And there was an exhibition game between the Boston Bruins and a group of local Newfoundland kids back in 1956. And, of course, now there's the NHL Stadium Series and the Winter Classic. Those are annual outdoor events. But this was the first one that featured two NHL teams, the New York Rangers and the Los Angeles Kings. And it was definitely experimental. This was not an NHL production, but an idea hatched by the Caesars Palace folks and brought to Kings owner Bruce McNall. At this point, there were no professional sports teams in Vegas, and none of the professional sports leagues would even touch Vegas as a location for a franchise due to the whole gambling thing. But an exhibition game? Why not? Who cares if it's like a dry sauna in the desert in September, right? You want to gamble on this game? Let's do it. It'll be fun. So the folks at Caesars took the what could be so hard approach to this event. Heck, they had pulled off Evel Knievel's jump in '67, a whole bunch of boxing matches, and they did a Formula One race, so sure, making ice in the middle of the desert should be a piece of cake, right? The rink was set up in the parking lot of Caesars Palace, and 13,000 temporary seats were built up around it. They didn't have any trouble selling tickets for this one. With Wayne Gretzky as a member of the Kings, it was a pretty easy sell, and then there was the whole novelty thing of it. A few hours prior to puck drop, the ice was covered by a tarp hovering about 10 inches above it to protect it from the sizzling sun. And it worked, but then when the ice keepers attempted to move the tarp to check the ice, well, the scorching hot tarp fell on the ice surface and damaged it. After an hour or so of repairs, they asked Jim Fox, who was a former player and was in town to do commentary on the TV broadcast that night, to go ahead, lace up the skates, let's go test out the ice. They still had some work to do, but if the ice wasn't safe, then the game would have to be canceled. A lot was riding on Fox's pre-skate. He determined it was a bit bumpy in places, but it was fine. So they kept working on the ice, and by the time the game rolled around, the temperature in Vegas was a balmy 85 degrees. But desert cool wasn't about to set in. Instead, as the night went on, the temperature escalated to the mid-90s. Being an exhibition, and with the ice conditions a few rungs short of ideal, the teams agreed to not get after it too hard in this one. No need to injure yourself or, heaven forbid, Gretzky for some dog and pony ice capades on a melting pond. And then the locusts came. And I'm not talking about some metaphorical reference, but a literal one here about actual locusts drawn by the lights around the ice. And they began to swarm around the rink, with a few falling on, well, I shouldn't say a few, a lot falling on the ice and then instantly dying. The players skated over them. By the start of the third period, the ice was in such bad condition that Gretzky didn't even come out of the locker room. Now, there was one other innovation that night. Kings goalie Kelly Rudy had been equipped with a camera and a microphone to provide unique on-ice views and some commentary throughout the game. Well, the microphone had technical issues and never worked at all, but the camera did, and it was the first time an on-ice camera had been used in a hockey telecast. The experiment of having an outdoor game on this night might not have gone as well as hoped, but the experience that the players had was a net positive. Aside from the ice conditions, the nostalgia of playing outside like many of them did growing up was great. It took a few years for outdoor hockey to return, but in 2003, the Montreal Canadiens and Edmonton Oilers played the Heritage Classic in Edmonton. It was part of the regular season, and there were no reports of locusts during that game. The '03 Heritage Classic led to the NHL routinely staging a couple of games outside each year, all of which can be traced back to what happened on this day in Las Vegas in 1991. On this day in 1930, Bobby Jones beat Eugene Holmes 8-7 in the match play finals of the U.S. Amateur. The event was played at Philadelphia's Marion Cricket Club. 18,000 patrons followed the duo on this day, becoming the largest gathering of people to ever watch a golf match at that time. There was a reason they were all there, and it was to see Jones achieve golf immortality. When Jones tapped in on the 30th of the scheduled 36 holes that day, he not only won the U.S. Amateur, but became the only golfer to ever win all 4 of golf's majors in the same year. Now, at that time, the major tournaments were the British Open, the British Amateur, the U.S. Open, and finally the U.S. Amateur. Jones was just 28 years old when he won on this day, and he immediately retired from competitive golf. He soon began work on a golf course in Augusta, Georgia, that would begin hosting the Masters 4 years later. It's a bit of a gray area, but many contend that the start of golf's modern Grand Slam, which includes the Masters, the British Open, the U.S. Open, and the PGA Championship, started in 1960, when Arnold Palmer won both the Masters and the U.S. Open. No player has been able to equal Jones and win all 4 in the same calendar year. But when Tiger Woods won the Masters in 2001, he became just the second golfer in history to hold all 4 trophies at the same time, having won the 2000 U.S. and British Opens and the PGA Championship for the so-called Tiger Slam. On this day in 1998, the Prairie View football team finally won a game. It's kind of hard to say which is more difficult to believe, that a football team could go 9 years without winning a game, or that after losing 80 straight, that they would actually win one, and do it against the team that started the streak in the first place. But indeed, the Prairie View Panthers broke their long, agonizing streak of futility. The only sad thing about it is they didn't do it in front of their hometown fans in Prairie View, Texas, but on the road at Langston in Oklahoma City. So a couple of things to know here, and it may shed some light on what led to such a long string of losses. The losing streak began on November 4th, 1989, when Langston beat the Panthers 19-18. Controversy surrounded the team in '89, with head coach Haney Catchings accused by several players of withholding financial aid money based on their on-field performance, or as he considered it, the lack of it. Those players sat out in protest. An investigation later revealed that in addition to that, Catchings filed fraudulent expense reports and more than $100,000 was missing from the athletics budget. Catchings was fired and later pled guilty, but what he had done ended up hamstringing the department, causing all athletics except for track to be suspended. There was no football team in 1990, and when it came back in 1991, football only offered 15 scholarships, and even playing at the 1AA level that allows 63, it was still a mere pittance that they could even offer players to come and play there. So the team went winless for 7 straight seasons, and the first 3 games of the 98 season, and it was super close to continuing on this day. With 34 seconds left, Langston scored on a 51-yard touchdown pass to make it a 14-12 game in favor of Prairie View. Langston went for 2, and after officials spent 20 seconds peeling the pile of players, it was determined that the 2-point conversion had failed. The Panthers celebrated, a little prematurely, but understandable considering the circumstances. They still had to recover the onside kick that Langston attempted. When Prairie View recovered that onside kick, they could celebrate in full, ending their 80-game losing streak, the longest, by far, in NCAA football. It was not the start of an immediate turnaround, though. They would go on to lose their final 7 games of the season. So from one underdog winning on this day to another one that did it in 2000, and I will go ahead and admit that I do not know much about Olympic wrestling. and even less about Greco-Roman wrestling. But on this day, American Rulon Gardner won the gold medal, and it surprised everybody. Gardner was a quiet, unassuming Wyoming farm boy. In college, he'd been good, placing 4th at the NCAA championships in 1993. After that, Gardner changed disciplines to Greco-Roman, which forbids any holds below the waist and emphasizes throws. It was part of the first modern-day Olympics back in 1896, but the history of it stretches back to the ancient Greeks. The man who had dominated this form of wrestling was Russian Alexander Karelin. Karelin had not lost a match in 13 years. His training regimens became things of lore, such as carrying a full-sized refrigerator up 10 winding flights of stairs, or spending hours outside in the Siberian winter, high-stepping full speed in waist-deep snow. So, you got one guy who'd been untouched at the top of the sport for more than a decade, against a guy who just took up the discipline 7 years before and in the Olympics for the first time. Oh, and they had wrestled each other one time before in 1997. Karelin treated Gardner like a sack of taters in that one, picking him up easily and tossing him on his head 3 times to win 5-0. So here on this day, not many were giving Gardner much of a chance. Now, this wasn't the most exciting gold medal final in Olympic history. Gardner played it safe throughout, parrying Karelin's attempts to swivel and hoist him up. In the second period, after a 20-second hold that might have made some newlyweds uncomfortable, Gardner squirmed like a worm, broke the hold, and escaped for the first point of the match. It stayed that way until the end. Now, the rules state that one wrestler must score at least 3 points, or the match goes to overtime, and so it did. And still, Karelin could not throw Gardner, and when the OT ended, the score stood. Rulon Gardner had beaten the unbeatable Russian and won the gold medal. We toss around the term game changer a lot. It can be a play or a person who alters the course of the game for his team, or it could mean somebody so dominant that they literally have to change the game because of them. Now take the original big man in the NBA, George Mikan, who was so dominant in the middle that the league widened the lane to move him away from the basket. Well, on this day in 1968, it was another game changer. Bob Gibson was wrapping up a dominant season for the St. Louis Cardinals. The Cards played the Houston Astros, and Gibson was painting the corners like a Renaissance master. He pitched a complete game, scattered 6 hits, struck out 11, walked none, and did not give up a run. St. Louis only needed 1 run, and they picked that up in the 5th inning to win the game 1-0, giving Gibson 22 wins on the year. Now, Gibson led the league with his 1.12 ERA, his 13 shutouts, and his 268 strikeouts. His 1.12 ERA is the lowest recorded in Major League Baseball for pitchers with a minimum of 300 innings. Gibson won the Cy Young Award and the league's most valuable player. His 1968 performance was so dominant that Major League Baseball lowered the mound from 15 inches to 10 inches prior to the 1969 season. And on this day in 1998, Mark McGwire blasted 2 home runs for numbers 69 and 70 on the season for a new Major League record. The 1998 season was for many years considered to be one of the most important seasons in Major League history. And while it may be too much to say it saved baseball, it certainly pumped interest and intrigue back into the game. I talked about the 1994 baseball strike that canceled the postseason and dragged on into the spring of '95. Well, there were a lot of upset and disappointed people after that strike, and baseball fans held a grudge. But the home run battle between St. Louis's McGwire and the Chicago Cubs' Sammy Sosa pumped life back into the game and made baseball must-watch television again. This was the final game of the season, and just 2 days before, Sammy Sosa held the lead in their home run chase. It was a short-lived 45 minutes, though, but it was close. McGwire hit a solo shot off Mike Thurman in the 3rd inning, and then he smacked a 3-run blast off Carl Pavano in the 7th to break a 3-3 tie, and the Cards won the game on this day 6-3. McGuire finished with 70. Sosa closed out the year with 66. McGuire's record would last just 3 years until Barry Bonds hit 73 in 2001. And time now for today's Nothing to Do with Sports fun fact. 1 milliliter of ocean water can contain about 10 million viruses. That's all I've got for you today. This and every episode of This Day in Sports History is researched, written, voiced, and produced by me, Steve White. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you back here tomorrow for another edition of This Day in Sports History. This has been an original Thrive Suite production.